I can tell you, having read the material on Amir, we're in for a real treat. It's going to be a disturbing occasion, in a sense, because we are going to be talking about violence and cruelty, but it's important that we deal with Mardi Gras not only as a celebration and a place and time of joy, but as a reminder that we live in a world in which there is terrible violence, great wrong, and that as human beings and moral persons, we have our obligations as far as we can to correct all that. And that is the essence of what we're on about in Mardi Gras. Mardi Gras was not just about gay marriage. I can tell you, you can get by perfectly well for a very long time without a marriage, a piece of paper from government telling you that you love somebody. But it's good that we got marriage in Australia. It's right as citizenship that we got it. But we're not here tonight to talk specifically about Australia, nor about me. We're here to talk about Amir and his struggle, and the struggle of his people, who are people who have been placed in a very violent situation to which, it has to be said, we Australians contributed. And it's therefore important that we should focus on what we're going to be told tonight. I think it's a privilege to me to have a part in interviewing Amir. I thought I was being brought along just to make a set-piece speech. It's much harder, actually, to interview a person, but I don't think it's going to be difficult with Amir because he's such an admirable person, and it's a good thing that we've come in large numbers to hear him, because his people deserve a voice, and he is the voice of his people. I also want to acknowledge the Indigenous people, not perfunctorily as we tend to do it in Australia, but honestly and quietly and respectfully, especially if we are lawyers, remembering the wrongs that have been done to them, often by the law and by lawyers, but the ultimate right that was done by the High Court of Australia in the Mabo and other decisions. And I thank Mint Ellison for arranging this event and for contributing to bringing Amir here, because he will bring us enlightenment. Now, Amir, you grew up as a boy in Iraq. Did you grow up under the Saddam regime?
Yeah.
And I was told that during the Saddam regime, it was actually a better time for women, for gays, for people who like to have a drink and other things. Is that a correct estimate, in your opinion, about the Saddam regime, or not?
Yes, I don't have first-hand experience because I was 13 when Saddam was overthrown, but through the documentation we've been doing, through my parents and families that we've known, we LGBT plus people were not legally protected, but they still had a lot of underground community, LGBT plus friendly bars and restaurants, cruising areas, and just being able to safely organize, which is no longer possible.
It was basically a sort of don't ask, don't tell society. If you kept it to yourself, you could find spaces, just as I did 50 years ago in Sydney, Australia, and that was how you were left alone, basically, then.
Exactly. I think the main thing with Saddam was, even though he was a big dictator and he's abused all kinds of human rights in his time, I think the main thing with him was if some groups are not against him, he's not going to really pay that much attention to them. And LGBT plus people were never really vocal about their rights in Iraq, at least not publicly, so they were not a direct target of Saddam and his regime.
Was he a Ba'athist? Was his political regime founded on the Ba'ath Party, which was a secular system of politics, I think?
A secular nationalist and just promoting the Arabism and as a collective, but he was not a religious leader.
No. And when he was overthrown, you were of an age of consciousness, so you would have known what was going on. Were you in Baghdad or were you in another part of Iraq?
I was born and raised in Baghdad, but at that point we were in the north, in one of the Kurdish cities, because my mom is a Kurd. And I remember very clearly we were told to cover the windows with plastic bags because there was this idea that Saddam will have a final attack on Kurds with chemical weapons. It never happened, but I remember these aspects to things. But both of my parents tried to keep us away from TV channels and things to keep us away from watching what was happening, especially me and my younger sister.
And the attacks on LGBT population in Iraq happened pretty quickly after the overthrow of Saddam. He was captured in 2003, I think,
Yes.
and the attacks to a level of about 200 people a month, or 200 people, it might have been a year, I'm not sure,
Yeah.
that happened after the overthrow of Saddam, and it got worse after that. But what is your recollection as you were still a young boy at that time, what is your recollection of that tremendous disruption that happened after the overthrow of the dictator?
I think, leaving a power vacuum after Saddam because there was no clear leaders. What the powers that invaded Iraq didn't really plan for what's after Saddam. So that left a big power vacuum in the country, and the division, even though all the groups were divided on who would take power, one of the few things that they agreed on is that LGBT plus people and non-normative people in general do not have a place in Iraq. So the LGBT plus friendly bars and restaurants that were safer under Saddam were actually actively targeted and either bombed or burnt, a lot of arrests happening, and LGBT plus people being targeted and even being killed.
And at that stage, you were still very young. And when did you get to a position where you were exploring what the LGBT population had to offer to you?
Yeah. I've had...
if I can put it that way.
I've started having feelings and ideas of who I am very young. I think I was 9 when I first realized that I had a crush on someone, a guy, obviously. Well, not obviously, but a guy. And I think since then, I never really had a phase where I was rejecting my identity, but I had a few years of being confused and not knowing what it means. I think I come from a family that even though they were not at that point pro-LGBT plus people, my mother always taught us to stand for who we are, regardless of what that was.
Was that because of her Kurdish background or not?
I think it was because of her family, not necessarily because of her ethnic background.
Tell me something about her family.
Very educated. I think her father, for example, every time she graduated from a class to the next, her gift would be traveling and exploring the world and learning more about what's happening in the world. And just herself, she's a very strong woman, and she's in a Muslim country in the 70s and the 60s, 70s, and 80s, growing up, going to college, wearing miniskirts, not being covered, smoking, even though her dad didn't like that. And just, for me, she's the OG feminist, the original feminist. I was raised by one, so it was impossible for me not to be someone who would stand up for who he is in the first place.
And she, I think you told me before, was a person with a long lineage, which was an important thing in a Muslim respect. What was that?
Yes, so my mom is the 27th grandchild of the Prophet, the Muslim Prophet, and they have a certified tree that tracks it all the way back. So on paper, she should not be okay with who I am, or that's the perception around the world, that Muslims will not be okay with LGBT plus people.
Well, it certainly is true that many of the stories you recount in the Iraqi reports are of the rejection of children by parents, and that seems to be more common than acceptance.
Absolutely. I think it's actually a really sad reality. In the last 10 years of me working with LGBT plus rights, I've interviewed so many LGBT plus people who were rejected by their families, who were actually haunted by their families and wanting them to be killed. So I think for me to have that reality in my work, and then to have a completely different reality with my own parents, with my mom especially, because my father passed away a few years ago, it was something that I was both shocked to have that, but at the same time, very grateful.
I wouldn't want to say anything today in this meeting which is going to cause any problem for your family in Iraq, and if you ever feel that I say anything that you don't want to answer, or it would be imprudent to answer, just don't answer it. But in terms of Islam, is it possible to talk about the situation that you are going to describe in Iraq without at least a brief reflection on Islam and homosexuality?
I think in today's Iraq it's not possible because it's a very Islam and religion in general is very embedded in the politics we have. So even though legally it's not illegal for LGBT plus people to exist, it's not legal either. So in that case, they rely on religion, which is, I think, one of the first articles of the Constitution say that religion is the main source of our laws. So it's not possible for us to talk about the legal situation of LGBT plus people without talking about religion.
And after the fall of Saddam, did they introduce a criminal code provision that prohibited homosexual activity?
It was actually the opposite. They removed the code that prohibited being LGBT plus. But that being said, it could be viewed as a progressive step, but in reality, in the rare occasions where politicians made any statement about LGBT plus people, it's actually that they don't even recognize that we exist. So how would you put a law for a group that doesn't exist? So we're so invisible that even the law doesn't recognize the simple fact that we exist.
Well, of course, in the common law, as you might know, the provision was often expressed in statutes as the crime that cannot be mentioned, the offence that is too abominable to even be mentioned and described. So that's not all that uncommon in the religions of the book. But a feature of Islam seems to be its great particularity and specificity in the hadith concerning the way in which people who are caught committing homosexual crimes are to be put to death. They are to be thrown off a tower, a building. And so I was really not all that surprised to see in material that you have produced to the United Nations images of apparently young people being killed by being thrown off a tower or off a building.
Yeah, that was, especially happened under the Islamic State in Mosul and the surrounding areas. And that was, something that was not new to the LGBT plus community, because the international community paid more attention to these crimes. But in reality, LGBT plus people have been killed in one way or another before ISIS, and they continue to be killed after ISIS.
But it does seem from reading the materials that you've presented to the United Nations through the work of Iraqi that it was much worse in the Islamic State.
It was more public. I think it's as bad under the Iraqi government. And in fact, one of the militias or armed groups that is an official partner of the Iraqi government under the name of fighting ISIS is one of the oldest that has carried out a lot of killing campaigns against LGBT plus people, organized where they publish a list of names of people who are suspected to be LGBT plus, especially feminine men, whether they're gay or not, and being killed. And that's been happening at least once a year since 2006.
And yet, in one of your statements, you've indicated that a religious leader in Iraq, who would be known to us as one of those who spoke out very strongly after the fall of Saddam, did caution against the violence towards LGBT people. Have there been many occasions like that, or was that just a sort of one-off statement by this particular... Who was that religious leader and what did he say?
It was Muqtada al-Sadr, who actually won the last elections in Iraq. He's not in power, even though his party won the elections. He didn't get enough votes to form a government. But I think the thing with him is, before that statement, he was actually the main driver of the violence against LGBT plus people. And then I think when he started organizing for a political campaign, he wanted to be politically correct for the international community. That's why he made that statement. And he said, LGBT plus people are rejected. They need our help. They are problematic, but we can't kill them. So he's still not, pro-LGBT plus people, but he's at least saying no more killing.
I once went about 5 years ago to Iran and gave a talk, and in it referred to LGBT rights and issues. And interestingly, afterwards, the European Union ambassador said, that's the first time I've heard this matter discussed in this country since the revolution. And yet, after my talk, I was surrounded by religious, by mullahs who came up to me and wanted to talk about it, and they were quite engaged with the issue. But in Iraq, there is no, your understanding, there is no engagement with the issue of LGBT rights. It's simply an invisible issue which the opponents wish to keep invisible.
Well, by religious leaders, it's not an invisible issue. They're actually the drivers, many of them are the drivers of many of the killing campaigns against us. But by the government, there were very rare occasions where they make any kind of statement. But the last statement that was made a couple of weeks ago actually was a big win for us, because the deputy prime minister of the Kurdish region tweeted that LGBT plus people should be protected and should be equal citizens. And that was the first time in Iraq's history that we have a politician making that statement. And it was the result of working for 2 years with his wife, because she works with human rights, to at least make a statement about the importance of equality. Aside from that, every single statement that was made about LGBT plus people was a rejecting statement, offensive, and not recognizing us as citizens.
And often the idea is put forward that gay people, if women, lesbians, only need to be corrected by rape, and that other LGBT people are the product of unsatisfactory sexual lives. Is that really what goes on in the minds of the opponents of LGBT people in Iraq?
Yeah, we're doing a media study this year, and we're analyzing some of the programs that are talking about LGBT plus people on Iraqi TV. And they usually host a religious leader a therapist, and then a community leader. And that community leader changes. And so far we've discovered that 92% of the words they use to refer to LGBT plus people are some of the words you've just mentioned, that they're sick, that they are mentally ill, they need therapy, they've been raped. Exactly, they've been raped when they were children, they don't have a good relationship with their parents, all kinds of misconceptions that are being discussed. And I think what makes that really dangerous in a country like Iraq is where I think 90% of the population in Iraq gets their information from TV channels. How many of them will actually go and research after they receive that information? So they go away with that information. And that's the thing that they keep discussing among themselves.
Can I ask you, your assessment is the antipathy to LGBT people, which on the material you've produced to the United Nations has it up in about 90% or even higher of the population of Iraq. Is that to be traced fundamentally to religion and religious instruction, or is it simply the dislike of people without instruction or exposure to the opposite, of people who are a bit different to themselves? After all, we in Australia have had a long history of racism, and it's not unknown for people just to want people to be the same as themselves. So is it religious? Is the problem sourced in religion, or is the problem sourced in something more deep in human psychology?
Honestly, I think...
Or both.
I think in general Iraqis are not as homophobic as we think, because we are expected to express homophobic opinions because that's the norm. So religion definitely plays a role in that, and politics definitely plays a role in that. Safety plays a role in that. Lack of information, the fact that before Iraq, we didn't have any organization talking about LGBT plus rights. We didn't have words in Arabic and Kurdish that are neutral to refer to LGBT plus people. So the words that we've had were faggots, they were sinners, terrorists, all words that are very offensive and are very biased against us. So even if you want to talk about it in a more civilized way, the words that you have are eliminating any possibility of a neutral, civilized discussion. So I think after being in this field for 10 years and working with Iraq specifically for 4 years, and my own experience with my family, I think introducing them to these words and introducing them to what it actually means to be LGBT plus will make a huge difference. But the main problem we have is that the political system and the social norms are not allowing people to express these feelings. So my mother is now disconnected from most of the people she knew because of me. I personally don't have any relationship with my extended family because they don't understand and they're not willing to read about these issues. But generally, I think the amount of people that express support to the work we do is a lot bigger than I ever imagined it would be.
But there's also, let us be frank, the problem of sheer brutal fear and violence, which comes out tremendously powerfully in the Iraq queer publications and submissions to the United Nations. Tell us a little bit about the brutality and dangerous predicament that an LGBT person faces in Iraq.
Yeah, I think it's important to differentiate between the violence committed by the religious groups, the government, and government-affiliated groups, which is, I think, more than 60% of the violence. So our government is actually the main human rights violator. against us. And then there are families associated with these groups who kill their children to protect their honor. Every year, like I said, since 2006, there has been at least one killing campaign targeting LGBT plus people. In 2017 alone, there were more than 220 killings of LGBT plus people. Until now, not even one person has been held accountable for any kind of violation, let alone the killing of LGBT plus people. Even through our publications and the report we sent to the UN, we continue asking and demanding for accountability for the basic right to life, because the right to life is the most basic right. Without the right to life, we can't talk about any other right. So if the government of Iraq is not even recognizing our basic right to life, that's a huge problem. And that's the thing that we want to keep pushing for now.
So how did, in this terribly dangerous environment, how did Iraqi get founded, and who are behind it, and how do you keep contact with it? You now are based in Sweden. You have a refugee status in Sweden. Wonder why you didn't try to come to Australia. But anyway, you're in Sweden, and
I wonder why I went to Sweden.
Yes, well, at least Sweden has given you the visa and protection as a protected refugee. Now,
for me, it's not at least. For me, that's my human right, because Sweden did sign on the Refugee Convention. And
yes,
Sweden,
but we also signed on to the Refugee Convention and protocol.
But I'm saying the standard shouldn't be who's doing better. The standard should be who's doing good.
Yes.
And Sweden is one of the biggest weapon manufacturers, even though they have not physically been in wars. They manufacture weapons that are used in wars.
Yes, now we're not going to talk about Sweden tonight. We're going to get back into the issue of Iraq queer. How did it get established? Who are behind it? And how did they get recognition in the United Nations system if they can't really exist within Iraq?
So I've been working with international Iraqi organizations before I started the organization. And I think one of the main reasons why I started it was because every time I traveled around the country in Iraq, we kept being discredited because I was working for international organizations. They kept telling us that you're a foreign export. Being LGBT plus is not a part of the Iraqi identity. So that made me think that we need to have something that's led by locals who are Iraqis and LGBT plus to eliminate the possibility of the public discrediting us based on our backgrounds. I reached out to different people, mainly younger people. Some of them I volunteered with, some of them I've never met, just interacted with online. And we started with a team of 3 people, me and 2 other people. And we've restructured ourselves so many times to find our identity and to find the areas where we can contribute with, because like you said, in such a limiting environment, we needed to be very smart and specific about the things we can contribute.
We can add to the fact that the media, far from being supportive or at least neutral or open to putting forward different points of view, have been a major source of the violence and whipping up public animosity against LGBT people.
Absolutely, and even a year ago, they actually had a specific report on Iraq. We were saying that we're funded by the Clintons and the CIA, and all kinds of conspiracy theories and all these things. But I think what really made us visible internationally is the kind of work we do. Some of the information we have, or a lot of the information we have, has never been produced before. We work in very strategic partnerships with local and international organizations who give us a different kind of legitimacy. Our international organizations give us access to international mechanisms, including the UN, and just interacting directly with embassies in Baghdad from different states that are supportive of LGBT plus people, and showing them that we're very we're trying to be as credible as we can be and as smart about using the resources we have. So after producing all kinds of work for a few years, I think they see that there is value in the work we do, and we're the only organization that submits LGBT plus focused shadow reports to the United Nations from Iraq.
And you do it both in the Human Rights Council and also in the committees, the Committee Against All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and other bodies in the United Nations. And it has to be said, has it not, that the former High Commissioner for Human Rights, Prince Zayed of the Royal House in Jordan, who has a very strong connection with Iraq, whose family were from Iraq, was absolutely wonderful on LGBT issues. How do we get more people like this into position? How do we get you into positions where this can be a voice for the people in Iraq?
Well, for me personally, give me time. It's on the list, to-do list. For other people, I think really, even though we talked about this before, Prince Zayed comes from a very strong family, powerful family, and that gives him a lot of protection, but that still doesn't mean that it's not coming with consequences for him to be vocal and inclusive for all kinds of rights, including LGBT plus rights. So I think we need more people to step out of their comfort zone, to recognize that when you talk about human rights, you can't be selective, otherwise you're talking about human privileges. If your rights only extend to a certain group of people, that's not equality, that's not human rights. You either have an intersectional approach and recognize that human rights, whether LGBT plus people, women, or any other groups, we're not talking about different rights. They're the exact same things. We're not asking Iraq to invent new rights to protect this foreign group. We're just asking you to extend them to the rest of the population. So just people recognizing that if you want to talk about human rights, you need to be vocal, inclusive, and stepping out of your comfort zone and use whatever privilege you have to advocate for other people. I think even though I'm an Iraqi LGBT plus individual, I'm a refugee, and that could be considered as a disadvantage, but I have a lot of privilege. I come from a strong family that taught me to stand for who I am. I have great education. I've traveled, I've learned so many things. I've had so many great mentors who've trained me and enabled me to do things. All of us have privileges. The only question is, how do you use that?
And in terms of what Australians can actually do, where does the funding for Iraq Queer come from, and what can we do in Australia apart from listen to you and marvel at your courage and determination and on how articulate you are? What can we do to be of support?
I'm sure all of us know we live in very special times in the world. I think the first thing you can do here is to keep pushing for better refugee policies and laws, because the violence we face in Iraq, LGBT plus people face, is not a temporary kind of violence. It will need a few years of social change and enabling the government to protect the citizens equally. So to be able to have, even though Australia is really far from Iraq, it's still it's not many countries that has the legal system in Australia that is protective of LGBT plus people. But also in the international community, the US withdrew from the Human Rights Council, which means we need more states like Australia, like other progressive countries that believe in human rights, that believe in LGBT plus rights, to be doubly and triple vocal about these rights, because whether we like it or not, the US is a huge power in the world and has a huge influence, and just not having that influence in the Human Rights Council means the other states need to pick up the slack, basically. It's not enough for them to say we're doing our part. You need to do more. And that's just a part of being a part of the international community.
Well, I think you'll agree that this graduate from Columbia University, who is so articulate and strong and courageous in the face of all sorts of pressures that we can even only partly imagine, is a wonderful herald for his people. And they don't know that yet, but it's very important that we give support. And I think we should think in the remaining time of what we can do to be of support for Iraq Queer, because the issue of gay marriage in Australia in the South Seas is not the only issue on the LGBTIQ agenda. And this is a big challenge for us at Mardi Gras time. We've now reached the end of the allotted time for interview, and there's now an opportunity in the manner of a democracy to have questions. So are there any questions?
Have there been any official responses from the Iraq government to the reports that have been submitted to the United Nations?
Not directly communicating with us. In fact, they have not responded to any of our requests to meet them, but the last time we made a statement at the Human Rights Council in June, and that was with the presence of the Iraqi government, and we're planning another statement I think in March, next March, where we're going to give the statement in Arabic so that they have no way to say we don't understand what you're saying.
But I've seen in my previous work on Cambodia and then more recently on North Korea that one of the advantages of the Human Rights Council and the regular review of countries is that basically they have to come and they have to sit there and they've got to listen. And it may be the only time in their experience that they actually have that. But it's a bit like Runnymede. We're beginning to get a world in which people just have to come and listen. And even that is a definite step forward. Do you feel that is there any reportage back in Iraq, or is there any way that one can improve the reportage through the internet or through channel television or anything of that kind?
We do try to work with media and journalists in Iraq. That's one of our focuses of this year. And with the new government, we just have a new prime minister and a president elected a couple of months ago. Both of them are very smart people, very qualified, and we're hopeful about communicating with them. We have direct channels with people who work with them. So we want to, and we have the reports all translated into Arabic and Kurdish so that the regular average Iraqis also have access to them and can read them.
Yes, it would be a good thing if we could make sure that this audience, if they wish to, can have access to these shadow reports, because they both tell us the dimension of the problem and the size of the challenge, and we owe it to our intellect and our education to inform ourselves about this. And hopefully we can get this message whilst you're here. It's not just about parties, Mardi Gras, it's about serious issues, as tonight demonstrates. Now, are there any other questions?
Just wondering if you can tell us a little about the official or unofficial network for protection of the youth.
We have members who are as young as 16 and 17 years old, and our oldest official member is me. I'm 28. In terms of protection, we have safe housing in a couple of cities in Iraq where we provide temporary housing for people who are fleeing violence, and some people end up living there for a year. A lot of them actually ended up joining the movement. So we try to use these safe housing as both a community center where they can live their lives and live their identity with other people like them, but also mobilize people and spark that movement. But in terms of protection, there's not much we can do. So the safe housing we have is actually illegal in Iraq. We're providing it through illegal channels, and a lot of times we've had to move it from one location to another within a day because the police might find out about it.
Yeah, I just wanted to know, what's the attitudes like towards LGBTI issues in the Iraqi diaspora around the world?
Most of them don't interact with issues, so including LGBT plus Iraqis who are around the world. We do have a lot of people who try to engage, and many of our board members are actually Iraqis who live abroad and are LGBT plus. But the vast majority of people that we've reached out to, either who are LGBT plus, either say no because they still have strong ties with their families and they don't want to risk that relationship, or because they're trying to survive in the new environment that they're in and they don't have any time and resource to invest in being invested with us.
What is your answer to people who say, look, be real, we've got a country which has been bombed, invaded, disrupted, children killed from things falling on them on the sky, and you want to talk about LGBT rights. Is this really a priority in the devastated circumstances of Iraq? What is the answer to that question?
We're not talking about LGBT plus rights, we're talking about the right to life. What's more basic than that? They're talking about bombings, that's about the right to life. We're talking about the same thing, but we're talking about the same right for different groups. And if you want to have a country where it's actually moving in the right direction, all groups should be protected. All the lives of all groups should be protected, not only a certain group of people.
There is in human rights theory a view that there's no right that is predominant over others, including the right to life. But you say, if we don't even have the right to life, if people are being singled out and subject to campaigns and cruelty and death and beheading and so on, then we fit into that category and we demand interest. So my question is, what has Australia, as a member of the Human Rights Council, done for your campaign?
Something tangible? Nothing. And I think, I'm sure a lot of people here know that the UN is a very slow platform.
Yes, but you're only on the council for 2 years, is it? I think.
Yeah.
So we've got elected. We had a big campaign. Lots of champagne was spent getting there. What are we doing about this issue? There are lots of other issues, of course, but what are we doing about LGBT rights in your part of the world, and specifically in Iraq, where we were one of the coalition of the willing?
Yeah. I think what they've been doing so far is attending some of the meetings we've been organizing at the UN. But what they can do is, for example, Iraq is up for review at the Universal Periodic Review next month, which the submissions are sent next month. One of the things Australia can do is to make sure that their recommendations to Iraq include recommendations about LGBT plus people. To have a specific recommendation about LGBT plus people's whether right to life or the importance of having accountability to the violence and the discrimination we face. So there's definitely, the good thing about not really doing something until this point is that means you have so much to do. You have so many opportunities to do things, so do them.
Well, we've got at least 2 action plans. One, I feel an email coming on to the ambassador to the Human Rights Council from Australia to pay attention to the shadow reports and to make sure that these things are raised and they are getting into the resolution that is adopted. Absolutely. So that it can't be completely ignored by Iraq. And secondly, for those who've come, and I'm very pleased to see that many of those at the back who perhaps were thinking of slinking away, well, they didn't, because this is really a gripping story, and it's a story of courage. In my talk earlier with Amir, because of the debates we've had recently in Australia about so-called conflict between LGBT rights and religious freedoms, I told him about the conflict and discussions we've had as to whether religious freedoms include the right to ban gay students from entering private and religious schools and to sack gay teachers. Is that just what comes with allowing people to have their religious freedoms? That's something we have to think about, but the fact that in Iraq the issues are more basic, really more basic, pervasive, widespread and fundamental is the real challenge that you have taken on. And even though you corrected me at one stage about the rights of a refugee, the privilege of a refugee, that was a very important correction. And it shouldn't have had to be made, because the fact is that if you are protected by the Refugee Convention and Protocol, then you have rights. And these rights are not always being observed by Australia. So you bring us a message, and you bring us a correction, and you bring us your articulate skill. You could have just settled down to a very profitable job. You are a very smart man, but you have dedicated yourself to equality and justice and to universal human rights. And these are the foundation of the new world order established by the Charter of the United Nations. And be not in doubt that ultimately your mission will succeed. But it'll take a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of support. So I think we should give a very hearty Australian round of applause to this nation.